Hello, everyone. Welcome to the fiction session of Toolkits. I'm speaking to you today from Gadigal land, and I would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of this land and pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging. I'd like to extend that respect as well to the traditional custodians of the lands from which we're all joining today. Sovereignty was never ceded, and this always was and always will be Aboriginal land. My name is Annie Zhang, and I'm the facilitator for this year's Toolkits Light Fiction program. I am a writer and an editor. I was the recipient of a Westwards Western Sydney Emerging Writer Fellowship, and my writing has been shortlisted for the Rachel Finari Prize for Fiction. My work's been published by Clear Darlings and Sweatshop Women, amongst others. I've edited various publications, and I was a fiction editor for VoiceWorks. And in my day job, I work in publishing. And tonight, we have the pleasure of being joined by the author Paige Clark. So Paige is a Chinese-American-Australian fiction writer, researcher, and teacher. Her first book of fiction, She is Haunted, was published by Allen and Unwin in 2021, and it was shortlisted for the Readings Prize. She has her Masters of Creative Writing, Editing, and Publishing from the University of Melbourne, where she's currently at work on her PhD. Her research addresses the relationship between race, craft, and the teaching of creative writing. So onto a little bit of housekeeping. Toolkits Light is an 8-week program for writers aged 30 and under to develop their skills in a unique and exciting online environment. Toolkits is run by Express Media. Express has been around for over 30 years, developing, supporting, and promoting young writers through workshops that develop skills, through opportunities for constructive feedback and publication, such as VoiceWorks, and through awards and programs that recognize excellence. Toolkits Light is generously supported by Australian Poetry. And this session today will be available on YouTube as a resource, and it will be captioned in the coming days. If you'd like to ask any questions, I would really welcome that, and you can do so on Twitter using the hashtag EMToolkits or via the live chat section on YouTube. So tonight, I'd like to speak to Paige about craft, creativity, and publication. Paige, I'm really interested in unpacking the ways that you've honed your craft and your creative process, and I'm also really interested in your experiences with publishing your book and how you found navigating that publishing world. So I guess to kick us off, I'll just introduce your book a little bit. So She is Haunted, this very beautiful book, is a collection of 18 short stories. So yeah, a lot of them are, really different in tone. Some are really quite sad. Others are very rather absurd and funny, and you often use surreal elements in your writing. My favorite story is the first one, Elizabeth Kluber-Ross, which I think was also a winner or came second in a writing prize. So in that one, there's this woman who's making a series of deals with God, and she's trading away various things in order to keep some other things in her life. And yeah, it's really, really beautiful, and it's a great collection, and I really recommend that everyone read it. So to start with, I guess the thing that has struck me the most when reading your book was your style. I think the way you use language is really, really precise. And yeah, you never overwrite. Could you tell us a bit about how you've cultivated the style and what you see as the power and the purpose of using restraint and omission in your language?
Thank you, Annie. That's so lovely and such a wonderful introduction. Thank you all so much for having me. I guess thinking about style, I started out as a bit of a mimic, so I was always really drawn to sort of 80s minimalist writers, so the Raymond Carvers and the Amy Hempels and Dennis Johnson, all of those kind of people that they tend to work in the short form. And I do think that precision of language and the short form kind of go hand in hand. I always make a joke that I would be a poet if I could be. Everyone always asks, where's the novel? And I'm like, no, I'm actually working on a book of poetry. I really like that constraint, I guess, a short story offers, and maybe a poem offers more so. But I think when I was looking at those kind of 80s minimalists, it does look at this really kind of like slice of life that tends to be really white, blue collar, working class. And so I'm not necessarily really any of those things. I maybe dip my toes like into whiteness. And I've worked in hospitality, but I wouldn't say that I'm necessarily working class. So I couldn't really find my own voice within those stories. So it was really a process of navigating that and then trying to find examples of, writers that were still, I guess, kind of working maybe in that tradition or in the tradition of short stories that did that language, that were doing interesting things, I thought, with identity. And so that's someone that comes to mind is Ellen Van Nerven. I love their collection, Heat and Light. And I think that does a really great job of spanning the surreal worlds that I try to do as well. And I don't know, I'm getting totally off track here. And I don't know if it's because because of that looking for a way to write my own identity that I've found more surreal spaces that maybe some of those minimalist writers that I try to emulate don't feel like they have to go to or don't go to, or if that's just the way that my brain works and I can't tell the truth so much that I'm making up these ridiculous things. And I guess that's maybe another reason why I'm not the poet. Not that poets have to tell the truth necessarily, but that I just find that I'm always fictionalizing things. So I guess that those are really my sort of style influences. That's a small range, and I read pretty widely, but I'm pretty particular about what I do read. This is getting to be quite a long-winded answer. Going back to, I guess, this idea of restraint and omission, I think, I hate to give too much writing advice around this because I think that what you really have to find is to find your own style that works for you. And I think that there's so many writers, that minimalism wouldn't work for, and that's not what they're trying to achieve. And if you're trying to achieve that, I guess there are lots of really specific techniques, but I think that maybe the thing that's universal in what I try to do is being really intentional with every single word that I write and going through in that really particular word by word, line by line revision and self-editing process. And I think that for all writers, especially if you're a maximalist, I mean, I don't know how you do it because it would just be so much work, if you have higher word counts or things like that. But I still think that there would be a lot of good that could come out of the exercise of making sure, that you have that precision at the word level and at the sentence level, regardless of what your style is. I guess for me, I'm just lucky in that I'm really drawn to things that are really pared back so I can do that editorial work.
Gosh, this is a great answer and not long-winded at all. Yeah, and I think what you say about intentionality is, really the key. Yeah, I think just being intentional in all your choices in writing is so important. You mentioned being drawn to the surreal, and I think exploring identity in that way. So, like, what possibilities does the surreal open up for you when you're writing?
Well, part of it is that I guess sometimes for me, I always want my fiction to emulate real life in some way or like find a truth that is more true than the actual truth. So my fiction often starts out as a way to, tell someone something that I don't feel like I can say in words. So that's the great irony because my medium is words, yet I'm still trying to, I guess, write the unspoken or the untellable or the unsayable. And oftentimes, for example, there's a short story in my collection and it's, I guess, dystopian or a bit sci-fi. And in the story, a woman goes and her partner go through brain surgery because, and this is really bad science, so for anyone who's actually a scientist, forgive me, but basically like in the premise of this book, if they were to remove part of their brain, then they could exist in higher temperatures because the brain uses so much energy, and therefore it would cause overheating, or I don't know. Don't quote me, doctors. I did have a doctor look over it, and they were like, "This is very flawed," but I was like, "That's okay. You're not my editor. You're just a doctor, and for once, I know more than you." um, but that premise came from me getting so frustrated with my partner because he could never remember any of the things that we'd done. Like, he could never remember the romance of our past. And I was like, how are you going to remember that you love me um, if you don't remember any of the things that we've done? He's like, well, I'm just going to know. And so that story was kind of about me saying, hey, my dog's just broken into the session. The Me saying to my partner, hey, how are you going to remember that you love me? And that story was a way, I guess, of conceptualizing that, which is that they have this brain surgery, the partner's memory gets removed, so he doesn't have any of these memories of their love. And then I guess you have to read the story to find out what happens. So it seems really surreal, but it's really trying to touch on something that is very true to me. And I guess, yeah, I don't know why my brain just thinks of that as being like a real kind of scenario. But when I write it, I try to think of it in that way. And like I can feel the situations as being, that present, or that like they're happening in that moment in the same way that they would in real life, even if it is in this kind of hyper real space.
That's so interesting that is the place that the story came from. And also that's really relatable because my partner is also always upset that I can't remember things about our love.
Oh no, he tries to convince me. He's like, I can remember the feeling of it. I don't need to remember the exact, moment of what was said or the specifics. And so I really tried to capture that, in the story. And at the end of the day, it's a love story. Even though it seems so wacky and wild, that's what it is.
Wow, I'm gonna feel like I relate to the story in a different way after this. Yeah, so I also wanted to ask you about, I guess, structure, because in one of like our recent Talk It's Fiction sessions, we talked a lot about patterns in narrative, and we looked at a lot of different shapes the narrative can take. And that for me kind of came from this book that I was reading, which is by Jane Allison. It's Meander, Spiral, Explode, if you've heard of that. So yeah, I was wondering if there are like certain rhythms and shapes that you're drawn to when you are like structuring and arranging your stories.
So as much as I feel like in this session I've seemed like I'm off with the fairies, I'm quite a methodical writer at times. And so a lot of times I'll come up with this really wacky idea like the one I was just telling you about, and then oftentimes structure is a way in for me. So I'm like, okay, I have this idea, it's really out there. Now how do I make it work? And oftentimes I'll be like, okay, in order to tell this story, I need to have, well, for this story, I'll use the same example of this brain surgery story. I'm like, well, I need to have the woman goes through a different surgery. So she actually loses the part of her brain, that's language. So I'm like, how am I going to emulate in language a person who is struggling to use language in the same way that we do, which is a bit of a challenge. And it kind of did my head in a little bit. But I thought, okay, well, I'm going to have the narrator switching back between first and third person, because that was really just, I guess, a trick. It doesn't actually have any purpose, but this switching of back between first and third person, it kind of gives this sense of confusion. And then in the story, the narrator is also relearning the words for things. So I thought, okay, I'll put all the words she doesn't know in italics, and that will be, part of the structure. And then also she's going to have this other voice because no one's going to know what's going on. In her mind, she'll need to be able to narrate it in a way that's clear. So there's actually italicized parts as well that are supposed to be her kind of memories of language, and they're written in sort of more coherent, really clear language. and then that alternates. But as her language abilities, as she regenerates them as the story goes on and she gets her language back, then the italicized sections become longer and clearer, and then the other sections that are sort of this jumbled first, third person relearning words become shorter and shorter until it becomes a bit more seamless and you can kind of see her brain reintegrating. So in that way, I really had no idea how that story was going to work, but I thought about the structure, which was that I want these two voices and then I eventually want them to merge and mesh. That was really how I thought. So it's not necessarily an arc that I follow, I guess, in the way that kind of Kurt Vonnegut pulls out his little plot drafts. But for me, it really is thinking of, okay, how am I going to do this on the page? Another example, and it's not from this book, but I wrote a story about a palindrome. I wanted it to have the shape of a palindrome. That's just all I thought was, I want a story. I want it to be the same at the start as it is at the end. And then I thought, okay, I'm going to collage it. So there's two different time periods going on. And it kind of goes back and forth. And in some way, it doesn't actually end up taking the shape of a palindrome. But I thought of that shape of what a palindrome would be like. And I thought, okay, I'll try to make that on the page. So really being very particular about doing those structural things like A, B, C, D, moving between time and space in a really organized manner.
See, is there any way we can read this story?
Good. I need to go back and edit. No, this goes back to the precision. It needs a lot more attention from me before anyone can read
it. Okay, yeah, fair enough. But yeah, that's really interesting that structure for you can be a way in, because I think for me, I often think about structure later on, and it's, maybe like one of the more final things that I think about. So is it for you kind of more primary? Like you think about it first, or?
I do think about it first, and I often will map it out. And I think part of it is because when I was learning to write in high school, and I know it's so annoying when you learn to write in high school, and they give you all sorts of bad advice that you should ignore. But one thing that was really drilled into me was the outline, like kind of, okay, topic sentence, like introductory sentence, like proof. And then I kind of started doing research and I still followed that structure. So I think there's a part of me that like is deeply ingrained in having this kind of outline for work. So especially with creative work, I actually find it so hard to write. And I don't know if you find that as well, Annie, but I find it really difficult to get going. So for me, if I can see that outline, then I can say, oh, if I write this paragraph, I'm that much closer to the end. I'm that much closer to completing it. So I find it really encouraging. And oftentimes then I'll stray from what I have, but I find that it can often be a bit of a roadmap for me. And it just kind of gives me that little way into the work. So the next day when I sit down at the computer, it's like, okay, you're up to paragraph C. You just have to write paragraph C, and then tomorrow it's D. And I often look for really mechanical kind of ways to get myself writing. I'm also really, word counts. I'll say, today I'm going to write 800 words. And even if I'm having a really good day, if I write that 800 words, I'll quit, because I'll just be like, that's your reward, is getting to stop writing now that you've achieved that.
So do you tend to outline for every piece that you write?
For the most part, sometimes it's way more elaborate outline, depending on, I like to do a lot of collage stories. So working with collage, then yes, it's really, at this point in time, this is going to happen, this event's going to happen, this event's going to happen, because I want to jumble it all up. So I like having it mapped out in that way. For stories that are more linear narrative, I don't feel like I necessarily need to do that sort of paragraph by paragraph or section by section. But I will often have the last sentence so that I know where I'm going to. I'll have that sort of first sentence, I'll have that last sentence, maybe a few sentences in between to just kind of give me something to write to.
Okay, yeah, I love this because I'm really bad at outlining and I'm always kind of just vomiting out words, and I never know what to do in outlining. It's always something I really struggle with. Structure, I really struggle with. So yeah,
It
this is
doesn't yeah, it doesn't necessarily mean that I don't have to go back and change it though. Sometimes I think there's a really clear structure in the writing, and then my first readers will be like, "This doesn't make sense. Why does this happen here?" So I think it can be a tool if it's something that helps you, but if you're not the kind of writer that needs it, I mean, it's just extra work. But also, I think, having that openness to not feel like you need to rigidly adhere to what that outline is, because I think the magic of writing it happens in those spaces in between all the planning.
for sure. So we have a question in the chat. So what do you mean by a collage narrative?
Oh, okay. So collage narrative is a story that's kind of moving back and forth between, it could be between anything. So it could be between different places, different points of view, different time periods. For me, it's often time. I like to go back and forth between kind of the present and the past. That tends to be something that I do. And it can be quite rapid. So it would be, like 2 paragraphs in the present, then 2 paragraphs in the past, and 2 paragraphs in the present, for example. And oftentimes they'll go between different themes as well. So that's why I'll kind of map it out, because it'll be like, okay, in this section, the narrator, for example, is talking about a childhood memory. And then in the next section, it's the present. But I have to think about, okay, what's going to connect these two sections together, but also am I going to put things far enough apart so that they resonate with each other throughout the work. I'm not sure if that kind of explained the collage, but another way to think of collage writing, is really doing something as jumbled as like kind of cutting up all of your writing into different sections and moving it around. So a lot of my stories, I feel like they could almost be read in a different order. And that's sort of the fun of the collage, is that you're kind of pasting and copying and moving things around.
Like a term that you've come up with, or has it already existed?
I definitely haven't come up with it, but I can't remember where I first heard it.
So I think like back to your book, I think many of your readers have remarked on the relationships in your book as one of its like main strengths, and you've portrayed many different kinds of relationships. There's like mothers and daughters, and friendships between women, and romantic relationships as well. And short stories are, like, as we know, a very compact space. So how do you go about fleshing out like nuance and dimension in your characters and the relationships, like within these confines?
Yeah, so I think for me, with characters, in order for them to be really true, I really draw from my real relationships. And I think this goes back to the thing that I was talking about how I'm in each story, I'm always trying to say something. I always think of it as being a letter, a love letter, to a specific person. And I think that for me, in writing characters, it requires two things of myself. One is being really vulnerable on the page, because oftentimes I make the character that I see as myself, or some reflection of myself, kind of be the most horrible person in the story. Or alternatively, in the relationships I'm looking at, the mother-daughter relationships, for example, they require a lot of vulnerability. I have to kind of go into these sort of deep, dark places of myself. And I don't think that I wouldn't necessarily encourage any writer to mind their trauma. But I do think that as a writer, for me, what I think makes it successful in my own work is allowing myself to be vulnerable and try to be truthful, whatever this kind of hypothetical truth is, on the page, to show those. Oftentimes I do it through dialogue, so I can really hear the way that these characters are speaking to each other. And I think that so much, for me, action it's kind of functional in the story, like action has to happen or no one wants to read it. But for me, the heart of character and the heart of relationships is in dialogue. It's the things that people say or don't say. And I think I could, I'd love to write a whole story just in dialogue. I think I'm very drawn to that way of showing how people interact with each other. And so I think I start with that. I start with, how do these people sound? How do they talk to each other? How do they orbit around each other? And usually modeled off of a relationship of my own. People say horrible things to each other all the time, and it's not, you're a disgusting pig. Like, it's not really explicit. It tends to be these really kind of tender moments where someone doesn't meet you, or talks around you or talks over you. So I think about, how we speak to each other as a starting point of character, and it shows us so much. And everything else, is a bit peripheral to me. And I actually got feedback on my first draft of the book of, I'd given all the characters the same jobs because I just don't care what people do. And I got feedback, how come all of these people are lawyers? And I thought, oh, I've got no idea. Like, it just seemed like, or they're always really basic professions, like lawyers or doctors, and even though I don't do any of those jobs, it's kind of, I just hadn't bothered to fill that in, because I felt like I filled in the sort of heart and emotional interiority of these characters. So then I sometimes have to build up, like, I often don't write what characters look like, because I don't really care. Sometimes, like, I just want to capture the feeling, of that person. And I think that, and again, this is like maybe a way to make the advice more universal, is that I think that you just have to follow your own instinct. One time I witnessed a crime and I had to do a police report. And in the police report, my description of the person was like, oh, their aura was just, it was very purple and it reminded me of a cloud. And the police officers were like, this is terrible. We have no idea how to identify this person. And I'm just like, no, but that was their feeling of the person. That's what they felt like. And they were horrified. They're like, well, you're a terrible witness to this crime. And I was like, oh, well, I'm sorry, but that's like what I saw. So I think, there's probably someone out there listening who has like more of a very clear idea of character, and they can describe what people look like and notice other things about them. And I would say lean into what your strengths are. So for me, it's that listening, it's that hearing. But for other people, you'd have your own vision and your own way of seeing people that's uniquely you. So lean into that.
Great advice. And lawyers and doctors, very Asian. So that makes sense.
It's like my aspirations that were never, my dreams that I never lived out, to be a lawyer in the book.
Yeah. Well, this is like a personal curiosity question, but I feel like many of your characters kind of like had similar names, and there were like many variations, kind of like on Elizabeth, like Eliza, Eli, Beth, etc. And for me, that was a really interesting thread that seemed to run through and kind of tie the whole collection. Are you able to explain the significance of that? But if it's a secret, you don't have to at all.
No, it's not a secret. So the big spoiler is that my middle name is Elizabeth, and I guess that's always been my writing alter ego for actually a really, really long time. So when I was younger, I was obsessed with Little Women, and I was trying to I was writing my great novel when I was probably like 8 years old, and really what it was just like a retelling of Little Women. And there was a girl called Elizabeth who was the main person, who was the Joe character, that had 3 sisters, which I don't have. Anyway, then the story, there's no originality. It just like the only change I made was that the character's name was Elizabeth. But when I was starting to put She Is Haunted together and conceive of it as a book, I really wanted to think of it as like a whole book, as opposed to just random short stories. And I knew that the thing that tied it all together was, I guess, putting myself into it. And even though it is fictional and it's autobiographical fiction, but I just knew, that was the thing that made all these stories go together, even though they seem like they go to such different places, that to me was the through line. So I did a lot of, I guess I am a bit of a planner. I did a lot of planning of this collection in terms of order, because similarly to the collage story, I really wanted the similarities to come at the right time. So I wanted the resonances to be far enough apart that it didn't feel repetitive, but still close enough within the text, or to have some sort of coherence so that it did feel like, stories were in conversation with each other. And I had just given the characters random names because it was one of those things I really didn't care about. Like when I name characters, I just come up with completely random things, and then I just leave it because I'll get attached to the way it sounds in my head, but there's no thought that goes into the character names. But with this, when I was starting to look at it as a whole, and I was mapping it out, and I was doing all those kind of plot graphs, and because it's a short story collection, instead of kind of being like a normal narrative arc, it has like all of these little arcs. And I was moving around all these cards that had the first and last sentence of each of the stories to see what butted out nicely against each other, and moving all around, like making a mixtape, which I used to do when I was younger. But when I was doing that, I was like, well, I think all of these characters, are me in some sense. And so I thought, okay, I think I might change some of these names, because I think that these are the same people. They're sort of different renditions of the same person. And I was talking to my partner about it, and he said, in my head, I was thinking, I think it will be Elizabeth because that's my middle name. Also heaps of nicknames, really. Like it's actually just the perfect name to do that kind of work with. But I didn't tell him that. And when I said, do you think this is going to work? Like if I give all these characters the same name? And he was like, yeah, I sort of always thought that they would be called Elizabeth. And the funny thing is I didn't actually have to change that many. So I sort of subconsciously had done it. Like they were all really close. So like there already was an Eliza, there already was like a Bethy, there already were like all these kind of renditions of Elizabeth. I just had to tweak them. Like there was an Olivia, but that's basically like the way it sounds on the page. It was already really close. So I think it was there all along, and it was kind of that aha moment where I'm like, okay, yeah, that's the right fit for this.
See, thank you for clearing this up for me because I've been curious since I first read it. And yeah, this is such an interesting explanation. Thank you. So I also want to go a little bit broader now and like ask you about your creative process and what that is like and what your relationship with writing in general is like.
Yes, so this is probably the most relatable to, or maybe not, because some people are way more disciplined than I am. And, I find writing really incredibly difficult. And I guess I just like to speak about that because I think when I was starting out writing, I feel like I went to a lot of talks, and I know it's different. I think maybe now things are shifting, but it just felt like writers were always writing. And I wasn't. And I was like, well, I must not be a writer because I'm not always writing. And I still meet writers now that are always writing. Most of my friends that are, authors that have a book out, they've already finished their second book, whereas I have no idea what my second book is. It took me 8 years to write that first book. I'm really slow, but I've sort of, just had to tell myself over and over, it doesn't make me any less of a writer because I write less frequently or less often, or it's really difficult for me. And I just try not to beat myself up too much because I need a lot of breaks. I'm a bit of a sprinter. So my method is kind of wait until I have a deadline of some sort. And, what has worked for me is having, I've got to find deadlines. So for me, that's been studying in some ways. It's having a publisher that wants a finished manuscript. It's having these things where I have to do something, and it can't be, and I hate this, but it can't be a writer's group. It just doesn't. I'm just not afraid enough of my writer's group. It like has to be something that I've either like put money for, or there's something on the line. Like I just need that kind of deadline. So I don't know what I'm going to do for this next book because I'm just terrible at sort of self-discipline. And then my kind of method is when I'm usually so panicked that I've got to do this really quickly, and I'll leave it to the very last moment, and I just get so much dread in my heart. And I kind of know how long it's going to take me to do something. So I'm like, in the back of my head, I'm just counting down. just counting down like, oh no, it's coming, I've got to do this thing, I've got to write this story. And I know that seems really counterintuitive to creativity, but for me, it's absolutely necessary. I don't walk around my day-to-day life just being this really creative person. Instead, I'm just mostly sit around on the couch or trying to avoid work and being quite tired. And then I come up on the deadline. I'm just like, I have to think of a story idea. I have to do it. I have to do it. Um, and then I just go into full work mode, which for me is waking up ridiculously early in the morning at like 3 or 4 a.m., not speaking to anyone, making a coffee as big as my head, putting sugar in it, which I normally don't do, but it's like a proper, like the more sugar, the better as well. And on these mornings, can't change out of my clothes. Like I can't do anything. The only thing I do is get the coffee and then go to the desk and start. And then I kind of sprint like that for maybe 3 or 4 days, or I think the longest sprint I've ever done is about 3 weeks of doing that every day. Um, and I just get it done when I have to because I hate to miss a deadline. I'm so afraid of them. But I cannot recommend it for anyone because it's a bit like I wish I so want to be a different person, but I'm not.
That's okay.
I just want to write every day, write 100 words every day. Sounds great.
Yeah, I want that too. It doesn't work either. But I deeply respect that deadlines are a good motivator for you. But I feel like for me, and I'm still very much a baby writer in many ways, deadlines create a certain pressure that makes my writing really bad. And yeah, I just, anytime I've written to a deadline, I've like hated what I've produced. So yeah, for me, I just have to find a different motivator. And I don't know what
Yeah,
that
I
is
think
yet.
that's the thing is that you have to find what works for you. And I think I spent so long being frustrated because so much of creative writing advice or just advice, no one is ever going to tell you, wait until the very last minute, drink a giant coffee, and then like inspiration is going to strike. They like make opportunities for inspiration. But for me, I know that that is my inspiration. So I don't know how I'm trying to like I try to get people to hold me accountable. Like I say to my agent, I'm like, you need to tell me I need to have this too. And she's like, oh no, don't worry, you just had a baby. Like, don't worry, whenever. And I'm like, no, you need to put the fear into me or it's never gonna happen. So I've been trying to get grants, like not because I mean I do want the money, but I'm like, if I have the grant and they're like, hey, what did you do? Then I have to do it. So that's why I'm like, I really need this grant because I really need you to be afraid of you.
Do you kind of like go about your days with a certain pressure hanging over you, or is it okay? You can still enjoy your life.
Not when I have a deadline. I become a terrible person to be around. And I sort of shut myself away from the world, but I'm really quite good at that. It's like if I've got something to do, then it's like no, I can say no to anything. I just become like completely in the zone.
Yeah, I'm also interested in like, I guess, how you have experienced publishing your work and I guess more specifically your book. So can you tell us about your publication journey for She is Haunted?
Hmm. Yes, no problem. So I guess I'm a short story writer, uh, and 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 as it is for many short story writers, I guess I always heard that narrative for so long of, oh, you write short stories. Oh, the publishers are going to want you to write a novel. Short stories don't sell. I heard you're not going to get any money for this collection. No one's going to pick it up. You're not going to get an agent. Just so much like there was so much negativity. And I was kind of in the university system. That's where I was writing at University of Melbourne doing my master's. Um, and I was just kind of like, well, I really want to write short stories. And I think that place of love that I start with, my love for the genre, is what kind of kept me going because all along the way, everyone said you can't write short stories and become a writer. That was something you had to do to then become a novelist. But The dogs decided to, sorry, I'll just ignore him and it'll go away. I hate to ignore the dog, but sometimes it has to happen. But yeah, so I just kind of thought, I don't want to be a novelist. And not that there's anything wrong with being a novelist, but I just didn't have any desire to do that. And I still don't know if I have any desire to write a novel in a traditional sense. But I kind of just bullheadedly went on doing what I was doing. And I think that this is something, I have a lot of friends that are musicians. And I think one thing I learned from watching them putting out albums is that when you see people, trying to chase a trend or trying to catch a moment for chasing, I guess, in the case of friends that are musicians, what's going to be hot for radio or record labels, but with writers, it would be publishing houses. You often miss it. Like, I think you often, if you're trying to predict what's going to happen, I mean, it takes me 8 years to write a book. So 8 years ago, if I were thinking, oh, this is going to be what's really trendy in publishing, I would have completely missed the mark. So I think the only thing that you can do is just do what it is that you have to do. And so for me, that was stories. That was how I came to writing. And that, I love short stories. I love reading them. I prefer them to novels. And like I said, I would be a poet. So I think it's very much just sticking to your guns. So I just ignored all that advice. Everyone said you can't be a short story writer. And I said, too bad, that's what I want to do. And every time I told people I was a short story writer, they said, until you write a novel. And I said, no, not until I write a novel. That's what I'm doing now. And I think I was just really bullheaded about what I wanted to do. So then I got shortlisted for that contest you were talking about, which was the Peter Carey Short Story Prize. And that was my first real kind of publication. And that early hustle is so hard. I sent my stories out to so many places, and it was just constant rejection. And at the time, I knew in the back of my head, oh, that's because it's really hard to get out of the slush pile. That's because it's really tough. Your writing is still good. But at the same time, you can't help but doubt yourself. But I can say officially that so many publications that I sent things out to, as soon as I had a book in the world, I heard from them saying, hey, do you have anything? So, and I know if I sent stories out now, it would be a totally different thing that I would hear back from people all the time. So, don't take heart if you're getting rejections. I got so many rejections, and I know that's easier said than done. But really, all these places that I submitted to, now I hear from them, and I'm just like, oh, well, where were you? Where were you 5 years ago? I'm the same person. I'm the same person and the same writer. Like, I'm not actually any different. I still think I'm a bit more experienced. And I think it's funny you said that you're a baby writer, because at the same time, like, those instincts and aspirations that you have, you're really still the same person, and you're able, to do the work on that level, but it's just about opportunities coming up. So through that contest, which I'd really recommend contests, because I think that the judging without being able to see names, it's kind of the only way sometimes to get that first publication. But that being said, even within competitions, I suspect that judges, have a sense of who the writer is if they're a well-known writer. So don't take heart with that either. You just gotta keep going. That's just such a tough time in the career, I think. I just found that time so difficult, but I just kind of kept going. And then I got an agent. But I had quite a bad experience with that agent, because she really didn't seem to understand what the book was about, and gave me a lot of advice that I just wasn't willing to take. Like, I should write a story about Kung Fu, that I should, add in Confucius, etc. Like, it's actually just quite funny. And then I got some really great writing advice from this writer called Robert Lukens. He's actually a family friend of mine. So I was really conflicted, because I'd felt like I'd hustled for so long to get to this point where I had this agent, and I really wanted it. I was really hungry for it. And I felt like this was my only opportunity. And he basically said to me, you're not going to make enough money off of your first book. And unless you're a big name writer, you're probably never going to make a living off of writing books. So all you can hope for is that the book is a beautiful object that you're proud of. And he said, and if you do that, like, this isn't going to be the only agent that wants you, you're going to find another agent. And so he introduced me to his agent. and the rest is history. That's my current agent, and she's amazing. And from the beginning, it was a different narrative. So that first agent had said to me, "Oh, you're a short story writer. Well, I like what you do, so I'll take you on as kind of a pro bono thing, like as my charity sort of project, my kind of one thing. I'm not going to make any money out of it, but I'll take it on anyway." Which now should have been like, now that I'm listening back, like that I thought at the time, I was like, wow, that's so nice. She's taking me on, even though she isn't going to get anything out of it. But when I got my second agent, she was just like, yeah, I think this is incredible, and I think people need to read it. And I don't care that it challenges readers or publishers' expectations. Like, I think that I can sell this in a way that's going to bring people to the table. And she absolutely did that. And then my experience with publishing was sort of the opposite. I had, I kept thinking, oh, the penny's going to drop. But I was just so lucky in that I felt so respected from the moment that I kind of met my agent, Grace Heifetz, and she was shepherding me through my experience of being published. I just felt like I couldn't believe that everything that was happening because I was a short story writer and I wasn't going to get any money and no one was going to read my books. And yeah, my agent and then my publisher at Allen & Unwin, they just made so many things happen for me.
Definitely, because I also like to write short stories. I've also heard that about short stories being very difficult to publish. So yeah, amazing that you've done it, and I hope this paves the way a bit more for the Australian publishing industry. So what was it like, I think, like being edited over the course of your book, becoming an object?
It's so funny because other writers at talks like this that I would go to, because I always went to a lot of writing things, and I still do because I love hearing writers talk about their process. A lot of writers, I would hear them talking about being edited for their book, and they'd say, oh, my writing really changed when I was edited. And I didn't really understand that. I kept thinking, well, how did your writing change? But I think for me, it was having a reader that was so skilled at asking questions and kind of pointing me to this idea that I was talking about with you before, like this idea of intentionality, and kind of, being able to really ask that question of work, whether as opposed to being in a workshop or being in a writing group where before other people, I think, had, for the most part, my writing group's amazing, but for the most part, accidentally kind of tried to just impose their own taste on my work, especially in the workshop setting. So to have an editor that would step back and really was saying, did you mean to do this here? Like, is this an accident or is this on purpose? Like that. And it seems like such a simple kind of thing, but I think I really didn't understand that as a writer until I was edited. I really didn't have anyone that was doing that for me. I mean, I have an amazing writing group, but we all write very similarly. So I think that that's why they were amazing at that point in time. And we've all grown since then. And I think now we're really capable in my writing group of asking those questions. But I think that editor's ability, and especially an editor who is not a writer, their ability to sort of see what the work should be and help you see that as well, that was really transformative for me.
I guess, so I also work in publishing, so I also am really interested always in people's experiences with publishing. And so I feel like when I was younger, I always wanted to work in this industry because I loved books and it just seemed to make sense for me. But because, publishing is the business side of things, it was actually kind of like strange, and like I feel like a vision I had of books and literature had to be shattered when I started working in the business side of it. And yeah, I was just wondering if like authors kind of have an experience of something like this when they go through that traditional publishing sphere. When you when they talk about business, like sales potential, marketing and publicity and all this.
Yeah, well, I guess going back to this idea that because I am a short story writer, I think I was just so happy to hear that there was any kind of marketing and publicity happening. And I think that maybe I also, I think for a second book, maybe I would be a little bit firmer about what I would be willing to do with publicity or not, because I think I kind of want to go into a bit of a, I want to be a bit more enigmatic, but I think I maybe just am not as a person. Like I'm pretty just here I am. So then that sort of works in terms of publicity. But I actually had the experience where before my book came out in 2016, my partner, my previous partner, my ex-husband, passed away, and I sort of became involved in the releasing of his final album. Um, and that was sort of his life's work. And I became very invested in getting that out. And I wanted it to reach so many people. I wanted to do really well. And I thought it was this amazing story. And it is. And because it was sort of his last artwork, it felt like there was all of this pressure, like so much pressure for it to do well. And then it came out and it was so anticlimactic. And I think I was incredibly, deeply disappointed by that. Not that it wasn't well received, because it was, and people have come to the album and they've loved it, and it was a beautiful work of art, kind of in the same way that I hope my book is. But I think I got really sucked into this is going to happen for publicity, and then we're going to do this, and then this is going to happen. And ultimately, all of that was just kind of smoke and mirrors, and it wasn't really that satisfying. At the end of the day, he'd still passed away. I still had that grief. But also there was this album, and the album was the thing that was really important. So I think I went into my book being published with that mindset, and I already had that experience of disappointment. And I mean disappointment in the way that the work itself has to be validating for you. And if you're looking for that validation from a big crowd or a big audience, or for publishing, that you're never going to get it, then it has to be kind of you as a writer at the end of the day. And then hopefully it'll reach readers, and audiences that it connects with. And that's what that marketing and publicity stuff is there for. So I think that having got caught up in that with the release of that album, I was sort of seasoned in releasing something that was really important to me. Um, and so in that way, I was really prepared for what was to come. And in so many ways, the book has done better than I thought. And I guess as an author, you have much less interaction with publishing than if you work in publishing. I kind of say that the experience of having a book published is basically me refreshing my emails a lot. Like it's really not that different, because you kind of like wait to hear from them, refresh, and then they're like, hey, can you do this thing really quickly? And you just do it, and then you go back to waiting for the next thing from them. So much of it is the email correspondence. Like I don't think I really necessarily see that kind of day-to-day grind of publishing, because I only saw, what was happening with my book. And I don't put that pressure, I guess, on myself as well for it to be, like a monetary outcome, or it is a job. Like I say, my writing is a job, but it's one of my many jobs that I have, and it's not one that pays the bills very well.
Been able to have like a good experience and to stay grounded in this way. So we have a question from somewhere. So it's, if you could give younger you just starting out in the industry one piece of advice, what would that be? So that's for both of us. Do you want to go first?
Oh gosh, I think I'm just a very optimistic, positive person. I think I would say my piece of advice to myself and everyone is just to keep going, and that you can do it. Like I think that my hurdle to writing was that it's actually just a lot of hard work. And I didn't want to put in that work. Like I remember at one point in time, a friend of mine who was a musician had a few big things happening in her career. And at the time I'd written 2 stories and had like one of them published on like a website or something. And I got really jealous of her. And I was kind of, in this time of my life, I was young and immature. And I was like, oh, how come nothing good ever happens to me? All of these good things happen to you. And I'm an artist. How come I'm not getting anything? And she was like, hey, that's not fair. I've worked really hard. I've been doing this for X number of years. You're only just at the beginning. you're only just starting out. Like, you've got to do the work. And I think that that to me was something that it really clicked, and that's really the piece of advice that I would give to myself and continue to give to myself, which is that, like, you don't you just got to keep doing the work. And at the end of the day, like, nothing happens unless you're putting pen to paper. And it's really hard, but you just have to keep doing it. And the more you do it, the more you put yourself out there, the more opportunities you get.
That is great advice. I think for me, I guess like publishing and writing separate things for me. I think for writing, I would tell my younger self to have fun mostly because I feel like the closer I got to spheres of legitimacy through like publication and like fellowships and that kind of thing, the more it became like a source of pressure for me. But you know, I always loved writing because it was something that I just enjoyed to doing. And like my journey right now kind of is wanting to return to that like place of fun and curiosity and experimentation and kind of like take myself out of that hustle mindset a little bit. And for me, yeah, I don't want to be publishing things unless I'm like genuinely proud of it. And I think when I was younger, I was kind of just like chucking stories everywhere. And now there's like stuff on the internet that I really like hate, and I'm like, oh, it's just there forever. So yeah,
Just don't
I
link to it. Oh, sorry.
yeah, I try not to, but you know, people can still find it, and it's yeah, it's embarrassing, but oh well. So yeah, I would want to be more selective and yeah, let myself enjoy the actual process of writing. And in terms of like getting into like publishing, I think similar thing. I think persistence is something you yeah really need, unfortunately, because it's very hard to break into the industry, and you just really have to try for whatever you can get. And it's really competitive, and like just like gaining continuing to gain experience through like editing and things like voice works and that was really important for me, and like meeting people in the writing community has been really rewarding. And yeah. And then so there's another question for me, which is, what do you mean your image of books was shattered when you joined the industry? Did you find yourself getting a bit jaded? The answer is yes, I did, because yeah, I just started to realize that yeah, books are just products, and they're just like commodities, and they're being created to be sold to bookshops, to be sold to consumers. And yeah, and it was just quite shocking for me because I've always loved books deeply, but you know, I'm like also I also remember now that you know I think storytelling and literature is an art form, and like I there are lots of books that I wish weren't getting published, and a lot of publishing is about like fundamentally it's just about publishing things that will sell, and sometimes because publishers have big books that will sell, they can publish things, they can take risks on like more experimental work, or things that are less mainstream, or like voices that aren't heard as often. Um, but yeah, I now yeah, look have to look at books in a different way, but there's still so much good work out there, and I think a lot of the best work is often by people who are less visible, like people like there are all these books that we know because they have a big marketing budget behind them, and you know they have a big marketing budget because publishers thought that they would do well, so they decided that this other book might not do as well. And I don't know, but yeah, sorry, this is long-winded, but I am jaded, but also I have hope, essentially.
No, I think you're right, Annie, though. Like, I think it is, and I think that, yeah, the work that I love and connect with is work that doesn't have that market value at the forefront, like that the writer's not thinking about it. And I think that idea of like searching for smaller publishers or people that are out there just kind of doggedly doing our thing. Like that's their way to combat, being jaded. I hope. I hope for your sake.
Thank you. Yeah, when you were writing, did you ever feel that pressure to pay attention to the market and kind of write for it?
No, because I think for me, like I said, it's never going to be about money for me. I just want to produce a product that I am happy with. And I think that, yeah, this idea of external validation, that at the end of the day, that never feels as good as like me. And I'm not happy with my work. Like actually, I can open any page of the book and find like a million things that I want to change, but I just have to like let go of it. But I think that idea of this book is for me, and if other people connect with it, that's incredible. Like that's great. But the books that I connect with are people that are doing that as well, that are writing the book for themselves because they feel like they have to.
Yeah, I completely agree. On that note, it's 7 o'clock, so I think we have to wrap it up here. Thanks so much to everyone for watching and for submitting questions and engaging. And thank you so much to Paige Clark for joining us tonight. I'd highly encourage everybody to check out this wonderful collection of short stories, She is Haunted, which is available now, and you can find it in your local bookshop. This session will be available on YouTube as a resource, and it will be captioned in the coming days if you'd like to revisit any of tonight's conversation. So thank you so much, and
Thank
goodbye.
you, Annie. Thanks for having me.